Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating. We are deconstructing the strategic maneuvers inside a highly tense political interview. Specifically, we'll be breaking down a recent back and forth between journalist Laura Jays and politician Angus Taylor. Now, this happened right after a pretty devastating local by-election loss for Taylor's coalition in the seat of Fadden, or rather, Farah. And just to be clear up front, we are absolutely not here to take sides on the politics today. Instead, we're basically popping the hood to look at the sheer mechanics of the arguments. We'll be looking at the data presented, the rhetorical pivots, and how politicians attempt to steer a completely sinking narrative right back to their preferred talking points. It's like a verbal chess match, and it's pretty incredible to watch.
So here is our roadmap for today. We've organized this into 4 distinct acts to make sense of the chaos. First, we've got the context, the by-election reality check. Second, the policy pitch, where we'll see how coalition priorities are defined. Third, the pivot, focusing on the general election strategy. And lastly, the evasion, dealing with the one nation question. All right, let's jump in.
Act 1, the context, the by-election reality check. Okay, to really understand the strategies being used here, we have to anchor ourselves in the immediate reality of this interview. The coalition has just suffered a brutal defeat in the Farah by-election. Now, interviewer Laura Jays, her goal is to nail the discussion down to these immediate uncomfortable facts. Angus Taylor's goal? Survive the questioning. Jays confronts him with some undeniably hard data. She points out they are coming fourth in local booths, polling the exact same as the Family First Party, and notes they literally weren't even an entity. It is a sharp, data-driven attack on the party's relevance. But watch what Taylor does. Instead of fighting the numbers, which is a losing battle, he engages in deliberate narrative framing. He calls the defeat taking harsh medicine and claims we were in freefall long before this specific vote. He's trying to take the sting out of the loss by basically saying, hey, we already knew this was going to be terrible.
I mean, just look at this crucial verbatim admission. We knew we were in freefall. We've got to take our medicine and get on with the journey. You know, it is incredibly rare to hear a politician outright admit to being in a freefall. But rhetorically, it's a highly calculated move. By admitting the baseline reality is rock bottom, Taylor kind of clears the slate. You can't be accused of ignoring a massive problem if you're the one admitting it right up front. Actually, scratch that. It's not just an admission. It is the necessary foundation for the massive political pivot he's about to try and pull off. So to explain exactly why they were in freefall, Taylor throws out this very specific internal party diagnosis. He draws a hard line between the politics of convenience and the politics of conviction. He uses this exact phrasing to strategically distance himself and the current leadership from prior failures. He blames past coalition bust-ups on convenience and argues that rebuilding trust requires returning to core conviction. It's a really clever way to acknowledge a breach of trust with the public because, let's face it, voters appreciate a bit of ownership without taking direct personal blame for this immediate by-election loss.
Moving on to Act 2, the policy pitch, defining coalition priorities.
Right, so once Taylor has admitted things hit rock bottom and blamed it on a past lack of conviction, he has to provide a solution. So he neutrally outlines the specific platform he wants the coalition to pivot toward, essentially firing off 3 distinct pillars. First up, returning to Australian values in immigration, stating point blank that mass migration has not worked. Second, dropping what he calls net zero ideology, arguing it just drives up energy bills and pushes industry offshore. And third, curbing big government spending to bring down inflation and interest rates. By presenting these super clear bullet points, he's actively trying to visualize a structured future platform. He wants to drag the audience away from the messy reality of the local election loss and point them toward a definitive, confident policy stance.
But here's the real kicker. The crucial point underlying all of this policy talk is the number 2. Why 2? Because that is the number of years until the next general election. Taylor repeatedly emphasizes this timeline. By stretching the timeline for success out over the next 24 months, he's basically asking the viewers and the interviewer to judge the party not on today's terrible by-election numbers, but on a distant future contest.
Which brings us to Act 3, the pivot, general election strategy. This is where Taylor's macro-level transition fully takes shape. He is desperately trying to pull the camera back from the local by-election to a sweeping federal election narrative. And to execute this, he relies on a highly structured, repetitive soundbite. If the vote sprays, Labor stays, and if Labor stays, Australians pay. It's incredibly catchy, right? This is the core catchphrase of his anti-vote splitting strategy. He wants to convince conservative voters who might be frustrated with his party that voting for smaller independent parties or spraying the vote will literally only result in keeping his primary opponent, the Labour Party, in power.
And this brilliantly illustrates the two competing realities clashing in this interview. On the left, you have the reality of the localized by-election, a vote following the sudden departure of a member who held a seat for over 20 years. Contrast that with Taylor's desired general election focus on the right, framing the future as a national binary choice to remove what he repeatedly brands a rotten Labour government. By constantly contrasting these two elections, Taylor is doing everything he can to diminish the importance of the immediate defeat. He's saying, look, the by-election doesn't decide the government, the general election will. However, Laura Jays is not just nodding along to this macro-level pivot. And this brings up the absolute pivotal question that drives the rest of the interview. Who is the real threat? This question perfectly bridges Taylor's relentless focus on the Labour Party with Laura's insistence that there is a much more immediate danger lurking in the actual voting data. And that leads us perfectly into Act 4, the evasion, the one nation question. So here we get a massive strategic clash. The interviewer decides to aggressively press the politician on the threat of a third party, and the politician steadfastly, almost stubbornly, evades the premise entirely. Janes cuts right through Taylor's talking points with this direct, uncompromising challenge. Labor isn't your existential problem right now, one nation is. It's a fantastic journalistic tactic. She's using those local booth numbers we talked about earlier to argue that conservative voters aren't running to Labor, they are bleeding out to parties like One Nation. Now, what's really interesting about this clash is how Taylor reacts. When Laura presses him hard on the fact that the coalition only has 17 seats and needs to address deals with One Nation, Taylor builds an absolute rhetorical firewall. He flat out refuses to acknowledge the premise. He just says, I don't think this is about deals with One Nation. And then he pivots completely back to Labor. He brings up the impending Labor budget, accuses the Prime Minister of lying about taxes, and reiterates that the main goal is removing a rotten government. It is literally a sheer battle of wills over what the topic of conversation will actually be. As the interview wraps up, this tension even bleeds into the physical optics of the campaign. Chase questions whether Taylor was physically present enough on the ground, and she compares his visibility to National Party figure Matt Canavan, who was famously out campaigning in his swag, a traditional Australian canvas bed role. Taylor again has to play defense, citing his national duties as a leader while totally insisting that he too owns a swag. It's a moment of light banter, sure, but it perfectly encapsulates the entire interview, a politician defending his overarching national leadership role against accusations of local irrelevance. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to consider. When you look at the entire structure of this political spin, admitting the freefall, redefining the party's convictions, and entirely pivoting the focus away from a current loss toward a general election 2 years away, you have to ask, does a future promise actually outweigh a present defeat? Can a politician successfully convince voters to ignore the undeniable data of today by pointing a finger at the opponent of tomorrow? Well, we've broken down the structure and the tactics straight from the source. Now it's completely up to you to decide how effective they really are. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes peeled next time you watch a political interview. You will be amazed at what you start to notice.